When we think of love, we often imagine it as an infinite resource, something that knows no boundaries and can be given endlessly. But is that really the case? Immanuel Kant, one of the greatest philosophers of the Enlightenment, offers us a framework to understand this. He wasn't necessarily interested in love in the romantic or emotional sense, but he was deeply concerned with the nature of duty, moral action, and the rational limits of human behavior. Through Kant's ethical philosophy, particularly his concept of the categorical imperative, we can derive three guiding principles, or laws, to help us understand how much love is enough. The first of Kant's laws might seem simple at first glance. Love should be rational. It's a curious idea because we often think of love as something that defies logic, something natural, spontaneous, and emotional. But Kant believed that for love to be morally good, it needs to be grounded in reason. Emotional love, if left unchecked, can become biased, capricious, or even possessive. Think of how many times people have acted irrationally in the name of love, jealousy, obsession, or even violence. These are examples of love that has lost its rational foundation.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound spiritual lesson.
For Kant, rational love is love that respects both the self and the other. It's a love that is universal and impartial, not clouded by personal desires or emotions. Imagine you're in a situation where you can help someone, perhaps a friend, but doing so would harm another person or violate a principle you hold dear. Irrational love might push you to help your friend at any cost, even if it means acting unjustly. Rational love, on the other hand, would consider the bigger picture: what is fair, what is right, and what respects the dignity of all involved. But here's the paradox: if love is to be rational, does that mean we should suppress our emotions entirely? Should we love others only out of a sense of duty, devoid of feeling? Kant's answer is subtle. He doesn't argue that emotions are irrelevant. Rather, he believes that emotions should be guided by reason. We should feel love, but that love should inspire us to act in ways that are rational, fair, and respectful of others' autonomy. In other words, love should never override the moral principles that guide our actions. This brings us to Kant's second law: love should be grounded in duty. For Kant, duty is the cornerstone of morality. We should act in accordance with moral principles, not because we feel like it, but because it's the right thing to do. This applies to love as well. True love, according to Kant, is love that is expressed through actions aligned with our moral duties. It's not enough to simply feel affection or admiration for someone. We must also act in ways that fulfill our duties towards them. But what does it mean to love out of duty? Imagine a parent who loves their child. It's easy to love a child when they're behaving well, when they're making us proud, or when they're bringing us joy. But what happens when the child is difficult, when they're rebellious, ungrateful, or even harmful? In these moments, emotional love might wane, but love grounded in duty persists. The parent continues to care for the child, not because they feel like it, but because it's their duty to do so. This doesn't mean the parent is acting out of cold obligation. It means their love is strong enough to endure, even when emotions falter. Interestingly, this notion of duty-based love can also apply to relationships beyond the family. Take, for example, our relationships with strangers. Kant believed that we have a duty to treat all human beings with respect and dignity, simply because they are rational agents like ourselves. This means that love, in the Kantian sense, extends beyond those we are emotionally attached to. We have a duty to love humanity as a whole, to act with compassion and fairness towards all people, even when we don't personally know them. But here's a question for you: can we really love everyone? Is it realistic to expect ourselves to love strangers with the same intensity and care that we show to our closest friends and family? Kant's third law offers an answer to this dilemma. Love should be proportional. This doesn't mean that we should love some people more and others less in a way that is arbitrary or discriminatory. Rather, it means that the way we express love should be appropriate to the context and the relationship. For example, the love you show to a close friend might involve deep emotional support, shared experiences, and a willingness to go out of your way to help them. But the love you show to a stranger might simply involve treating them with respect, fairness, and kindness. Both forms of love are important, but they are expressed differently based on the nature of the relationship. This idea of proportional love is crucial because it acknowledges the limits of our capacity to love. As human beings, we have finite emotional and physical resources. We can't give everything to everyone, nor should we try to. Kant's law of proportional love suggests that we must be wise in how we allocate our love and care. It's not about loving less, it's about loving in a way that is sustainable and appropriate to the situation. But how do we know when we've reached the right balance? How do we determine when we've given enough love, but not too much? This is where Kant's philosophy becomes deeply personal. It requires us to engage in constant self-reflection, to ask ourselves whether our love is rational, whether it is grounded in duty, and whether it is proportional to the situation. These are not easy questions, and there is no simple formula for answering them. But by continually asking ourselves these questions, we can begin to approach what Kant might call perfect love, a love that is both deeply moral and deeply human. So, how much love is enough? Kant's three laws offer us a framework to explore this question, but the answer ultimately lies within each of us. It requires us to strike a delicate balance between emotion and reason, between duty and desire, between the needs of others and the limits of our own capacities. Love, in the Kantian sense, is not about grand gestures or limitless devotion. It's about acting in ways that reflect our highest moral principles, even when it's difficult, even when it requires sacrifice, and even when it challenges our deepest emotional instincts. But here's a final question for you to ponder: what would the world look like if we all practiced love in this way? If we all embraced Kant's three laws of love: rationality, duty, and proportionality, how would our relationships change? How would our society change? And perhaps most importantly, how would we change? As we move deeper into the question of how much love is enough, it becomes clear that love, like any other human capacity, has its limits. We are not infinite beings. We have finite time, finite energy, and finite emotional reserves. And yet, many of us struggle with the idea of setting boundaries when it comes to love. We feel guilty when we say no, or when we draw a line between what we can and cannot give. But Kant's philosophy teaches us that setting limits is not only necessary, it's also deeply moral. At the heart of this idea is the notion that love, to be truly meaningful, must be sustainable. If we give endlessly without regard for our own well-being, we risk burning out, becoming resentful, or even losing the capacity to love at all. Think of the classic example of the caregiver who spends so much time and energy caring for others that they neglect their own health and happiness. At first, this might seem like a noble sacrifice, an example of selfless love. But over time, this kind of love can become self-destructive, leading to physical exhaustion, emotional numbness, or even a collapse of the relationship itself. Kant would argue that this kind of love is not truly moral because it fails to respect the dignity and autonomy of the self. Just as we have a duty to love others, we also have a duty to love ourselves. This doesn't mean that we should be selfish or self-centered. Rather, it means that we should recognize our own worth and ensure that our acts of love do not come at the cost of our own well-being. But how do we know when we've reached the point where we need to say enough? How do we balance the desire to give with the need to protect ourselves? This is one of the most difficult questions we face as human beings, and there is no easy answer. But Kant's philosophy offers us some guidance. First, we must recognize that love is not a zero-sum game. Giving love to others doesn't mean that we have to deplete ourselves in the process. In fact, true love that is rational, grounded in duty, and proportional can actually enhance our own well-being. When we love in a way that respects both ourselves and others, we create relationships that are mutually supportive, where both parties grow and flourish. This is the kind of love that Kant envisions, a love that is sustainable, balanced, and life-affirming. But this kind of love requires us to be honest with ourselves about our own limits. It requires us to recognize when we are giving too much, when we are sacrificing our own needs for the sake of others, and when we are allowing ourselves to be taken advantage of. This is not always easy, especially in relationships where we feel a deep emotional attachment or a strong sense of duty. But it is essential if we are to love in a way that is truly moral and sustainable. One of the key insights from Kant's philosophy is that love should never be coercive. We should never feel forced to love, nor should we force others to love us. True love, according to Kant, is based on mutual respect and autonomy. This means that we must allow others the freedom to choose how much love they can give, just as we must allow ourselves the freedom to set our own boundaries. But here's the challenge: how do we distinguish between healthy boundaries and selfishness? How do we know when we are protecting ourselves versus when we are simply withholding love out of fear or insecurity? This is a question that requires deep self-reflection. We must be willing to examine our own motives, to ask ourselves whether we are acting out of love or out of self-interest. And we must be willing to listen to the needs of others, to understand their perspective, and to find a balance that respects both parties. This brings us to another crucial point: love requires communication. If we are to set healthy boundaries in love, we must be able to communicate those boundaries clearly and compassionately. This means being honest about our needs, our limits, and our expectations. It means being willing to have difficult conversations, to listen to the needs of others, and to find compromises that work for everyone involved. But communication is not just about setting boundaries, it's also about deepening our understanding of what love truly is. Too often we equate love with sacrifice, with giving endlessly until we have nothing left. But Kant's philosophy challenges this notion. Love, in its truest form, is not about self-sacrifice, it's about mutual respect, shared values, and a commitment to the well-being of both the self and the other. In this sense, love is not just an emotion, it's a practice. It's something we cultivate through our actions, our decisions, and our relationships. And like any practice, it requires balance, reflection, and a willingness to learn from our mistakes. So how much love is enough? Kant's three laws, rationality, duty, and proportionality, offer us a framework for answering this question. But ultimately, the answer lies within each of us. It requires us to engage in a constant process of self-reflection, to examine our own motives, and to strive for a love that is both deeply moral and deeply human. But here's a final question for you. What would it look like to live a life where love is always guided by reason and moral duty? What kind of relationships would we create if we always acted in accordance with Kant's three laws of love, rationality, duty, and proportionality? Is it even possible to live in this way, or are we destined to fall short of this ideal? As we come to the end of this philosophical journey, it's clear that the question of how much love is enough has no simple answer. Love, in all its forms, is complex, challenging, and deeply human. But by engaging with Kant's philosophy, we can begin to approach love in a way that is both deeply moral and deeply fulfilling. We can strive for a love that is rational, grounded in duty, and proportional to the needs of others. And while we may never achieve perfect love, the act of striving towards it is what gives our relationships meaning and significance. Kant's philosophy offers a unique perspective on this question. For Kant, perfection isn't necessarily about achieving a flawless state of being. Rather, it's about striving towards an ideal, even if we know that we'll never fully attain it. In the context of love, this means that while we may never be able to love completely, without any limits or flaws, we can still aim to love in a way that aligns with our highest moral principles. But here's the paradox: if we know that perfect love is unattainable, is it still worth striving for? Can we find meaning and fulfillment in love, even if we know that we'll never reach perfection? Kant's answer is yes. In fact, it is precisely because perfection is unattainable that the pursuit of it becomes meaningful. The act of striving, of constantly working to improve ourselves and our relationships, is what gives love its depth and significance. In this sense, love is not a destination, it's a journey. It's not something that we achieve once and for all, but something that we work towards throughout our lives. And this is where Kant's philosophy becomes deeply practical. While we may never love perfectly, we can always love better. We can always find ways to be more compassionate, more understanding, more respectful of others' autonomy. And in doing so, we create relationships that are richer, more meaningful, and more fulfilling. But how do we know if we're moving in the right direction? How do we measure our progress in the pursuit of perfect love? This is where Kant's concept of moral law becomes crucial. For Kant, moral law is not something external. It's not a set of rules imposed on us by society or religion. Rather, it's something that we discover within ourselves through the use of reason. It's the voice of our conscience, guiding us towards actions that respect the dignity and autonomy of others. In the context of love, this means that we must constantly ask ourselves whether our actions are in line with our moral principles. Are we loving in a way that is fair, respectful, and rational? Are we treating others as ends in themselves rather than as means to our own ends? These are the kinds of questions that Kant encourages us to ask, and they provide a roadmap for how we can strive towards perfect love, even if we know that we'll never fully reach it. But here's another paradox. If love is supposed to be rational and grounded in duty, does that mean we should suppress our emotions? Should we strive to love in a purely detached, intellectual way, devoid of passion or desire? Kant's answer is nuanced. He doesn't argue that we should eliminate our emotions. After all, love without emotion would be empty and lifeless. Rather, he believes that our emotions should be guided by reason. We should feel love, but that love should inspire us to act in ways that are rational, fair, and respectful of others' autonomy. This is where Kant's philosophy can be incredibly difficult to put into practice. We are, after all, emotional beings. We love deeply. We feel joy, pain, excitement, and sorrow. And sometimes our emotions can overwhelm our reason, leading us to act in ways that are irrational or even harmful. Think of how many times people have acted out of jealousy, possessiveness, or fear in the name of love. These emotions, while powerful, can cloud our judgment and lead us away from the kind of love that Kant envisions, a love that is rational, moral, and deeply respectful of others. But here's a question for you: can we really control our emotions in the way that Kant suggests? Is it possible to love someone deeply and passionately while still maintaining a sense of rationality and moral duty? Or is this simply an impossible ideal that ignores the messy, complicated nature of human relationships? In many ways, this question gets to the heart of what it means to be human. We are not purely rational beings, nor are we purely emotional. We are a complex blend of both, constantly navigating the tension between our rational mind and our emotional heart. And this is why love is so challenging, because it requires us to find a balance between these two forces, to love in a way that is both deeply felt and deeply thoughtful. But Kant's philosophy offers us a way to navigate this tension. By grounding our love in duty and rationality, we can ensure that our emotions don't lead us astray. We can love passionately, but we can also love wisely. We can care deeply for others, but we can also respect their autonomy and dignity. In this sense, Kant's philosophy is not about suppressing our emotions, it's about guiding them in a way that leads to the highest form of love. This brings us to an even more profound question: what is the purpose of love? Why do we love in the first place? And what are we hoping to achieve through our relationships with others? For Kant, the purpose of love is not simply to fulfill our own desires or to make ourselves happy. Rather, it's about creating a world in which all human beings are treated with respect and dignity. Love, in the Kantian sense, is an expression of our moral duty to others. It's a way of recognizing their inherent worth as rational agents and of acting in ways that promote their well-being. But this raises another question: can love ever be truly selfless? After all, when we love someone, we often expect something in return, whether it's affection, support, or companionship. Even when we act out of pure duty, there's often a sense of personal satisfaction or fulfillment that comes from knowing we've done the right thing. So, is it possible to love in a way that is completely free of self-interest? Or is all love, at some level, inherently selfish? Kant would argue that while love may never be entirely free of self-interest, we can still strive to love in a way that prioritizes the well-being of others. This is where the concept of universalizability comes into play. One of Kant's most famous principles is that we should act only according to maxims that we can consistently will to be universal laws. In other words, we should love in a way that we would want everyone to love. This means that our love should be fair, impartial, and respectful of the dignity of all individuals. But here's the challenge: how do we apply this principle in our everyday lives? How do we ensure that our love is not biased by personal desires or emotions? This is where the practice of self-reflection becomes essential. Kant encourages us to constantly examine our motives, to ask ourselves whether we are acting out of self-interest or out of a genuine concern for the well-being of others. This is not an easy task. It requires us to be brutally honest with ourselves, to confront our own flaws and weaknesses, and to strive for a love that is truly moral and just. But here's a final question for you to consider: what would it look like to live a life where love is always enough, where we give freely, but also protect ourselves, where we act out of duty, but also out of joy, where we love others, but also love ourselves? What kind of world could we create if we all practiced love in this way? As we delve even deeper into the question of how much love is enough, we find ourselves confronting an even more profound issue: the idea of perfection. Kant, like many philosophers before and after him, was deeply concerned with the idea of moral perfection, that is, the pursuit of the highest possible moral standards. But when it comes to love, what does perfection look like? Can we ever truly love perfectly? Or is the pursuit of perfect love an impossible ideal that will only lead to disappointment and frustration? So, how much love is enough? Perhaps the answer lies not in how much we love, but in how we love. If we can love in a way that respects the dignity of others, that is guided by reason and moral duty, and that is proportional to the situation, then we can begin to approach the ideal of perfect love. And in doing so, we create a world in which love is not just an emotion, but a practice, a way of living that reflects our highest moral principles and our deepest humanity. Thank you for watching.